Alrighty. Hey everyone, this is AJ, Steven. Dr. Dan decided to join us again. We are very appreciative of that. Hopefully you like Dr. Dan, and he specifically told me to not say he cuts people for a living. So I am announcing that just for clarification. And we have a new guest on the show today. It's Tom Jump. Tom is an aspiring president of the US. I will put his podcast link in the description. Feel free to follow it. I learn a lot from it, and hopefully you guys will too. And I'll let Tom introduce himself. Tom?
That's good. That sounds good. I do philosophy. I sell bathtubs. I sleep occasionally. Check out my YouTube channel. Send me money. Patreon.com/tjump.
Yeah, let's share Patreon, YouTube, Facebook as well, right?
Pornhub, OnlyFans, Grindr.
Perfect. Moving on. I'll start. The first article I have is from South Africa. Essentially, Rosgeo, the state-owned Russian exploration company's research vessel, which has been prospecting oil and natural gas in Antarctic region since 1970s. It actually docked in South Africa, which caused a lot of uproar from the rebellion environmental group, calling for protests all over South Africa. Earlier this week, several dozen protesters from Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion demonstrated at the port, saying the ship's seismic surveys were a threat to marine life in the area and violated a 1958 international agreement. This has been a concern for the marine life per the protesters. An amendment to the Antarctic Treaty in 1998, to which both Russia and South Africa are signatories, prohibits all mineral explorations and extractions in the region. South Africa's foreign ministry did not immediately reply to the request for a comment, and President Cyril Ramaphosa, his government, his friendly relationship with Russia, South Africa says it is impartial on Ukraine conflict and has abstained from voting on UN resolutions on the war. One of the discussions we had in the past few episodes was about the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa collaboration, the rising dominance. I feel like South Africa is siding with Russia and supporting them critically on this issue, even despite renewed interest in the green energy globally, as well as their comparative mutedness on the Russian-Ukraine conflict. I feel this is quite related to the same thing. What do you think?
So you're saying that there is a Russian ship that is looking for natural resources that goes around using seismic technology, which disturbs the natural life, and the protesters of natural wildlife are upset by this. So they're protesting, which is okay, but why did the ship dock there? Does it have anything to do with the government? Was it an emergency thing? Did the government choose to do this? Were they paid to do this? I think these are all relevant factors that determine the significance of whether or not the ship docking there has any relevance to the government's stance on what it should do. And I think just allowing it to dock there really doesn't have any significance to the government or what the protest should be trying to accomplish. There's a bunch of facts there that just don't seem to be filled in yet.
So the idea is essentially, if you look at the South African geographical location, it is the southern tip. It's pretty close to Antarctica. And in the area, it provides a good stopping point for the ships to fuel up. Essentially, a ship from Russia going to Antarctica and doing their research. South Africa provides like a buffer zone where they can stop, fuel up, then proceed with their journey. The protesters are raising concerns against South African government allowing the Russian ship to dock and continuing their exploration, which for them is gonna exploit the resources in Antarctica and cause harm to the marine life there.
So the protesters are arguing that they shouldn't allow ships to dock in the South African ports.
Their argument is they should not make it feasible for the ships to continue their exploration. What South African government right now is doing is enabling the exploration, which for them is harming the environment.
Enabling how? Like how much do they charge to let someone dock at this port? Is it docked at a private port?
No, it's apparently the national port. Article does not cover that information.
So like what would be the proposed policy to make it infeasible? Like charge them $1 billion or something? Like I don't feel like many protests describe meaningful goals. I think that's why most protests are kind of useless. You have to have a meaningful actual goal of what you're trying to accomplish with realistic policy suggestions, and just saying protesting things you don't like is not a successful strategy to do anything.
Yeah, the article does not cover any more relevant information related to what the protesters are aiming towards. It just says protest aims to curb down the extraction of the resources in Antarctica. And there was an amendment to the treaty in 1998, which prohibits all explorations and extractions in the region, which seems like allowing ships to dock there, they are violating the treaty.
Okay, so it could be a legal issue is what you're saying.
Yes.
Well, yeah, they'd have to look into it. If Russia is really using this as a means of gaining more resources or going to Antarctica to search for them, it's certainly a plausible thing, but they would absolutely have to really prove that. And it would probably be a long court battle considering that international parties are concerned. So this gets messy really quick.
I think there's also a question as to how the resources will be extracted, whether or not this will lead to disruption of the plants and wildlife that exists there and what impacts that might have.
True.
Well, it's an Arctic vessel, right? So it's going to be oil rigs that are going to drill into the ground beneath the Arctic in order to pull out the oil. I don't think it has many other resources there.
I mean, hydrocarbons, oil, minerals trapped in the surface for years because of the relatively lesser exposure to the rest of the world.
Yeah, you can pretty much guarantee it's going to damage the environment. I don't think there's any company that gathers natural resources that doesn't damage the environment.
True.
Should we care about the environment at all?
I believe we do.
Why?
Only one Earth. There's no planet B, and we're not getting to Mars.
What's the worst case scenario? Let's say we burn all oil and gas and fuel. What's going to happen?
I would say the main factors would be contributing to rising sea levels, especially if we're doing Antarctica, where we would be displacing ice directly, likely causing it to be melting at an accelerated rate. A lot of coastal cities would see major impacts as they already are. Beyond that, it's just kind of a spiral.
What is the sea level rise that's estimated in the next 100 years or so?
I'd have to look that up. It's a good question.
I think last I checked, it was roughly 7.2 meters every 10 years. I might be mistaken.
Seems extremely high to me.
Moving on, we have news from Israel where there have been several attacks going on between Israel and Palestine, which is part of the ongoing conflict. And recently, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, he vows to strengthen West Bank settlements after the attacks. A series of measures have been announced after two gun attacks that left 7 people dead during one of the bloodiest months in West Bank and east of Jerusalem. A Palestinian gunman killed 7 people when he opened fire outside a synagogue in Neve Yaakov in East Jerusalem. Hours later, 2 people were wounded when a 13-year-old Palestinian boy opened fire on a group of 5 civilians on Saturday. The security office plans to cancel social security and health benefits for the families of the attackers. The weekend shootings followed a deadly Israeli raid in the West Bank on Thursday that killed 9 Palestinians, most of them militants. In all, 32 Palestinians have been killed in fighting this month. Friday's shooting has been one of the biggest one in the recent time. In response to the shooting, Israeli police beefed up activities throughout East Jerusalem and said they had arrested 42 people, including family members who were connected to the gunman. Biden and his administration, which condemned Friday's shooting, opposes settlement construction in East Jerusalem and the West Bank lands sought by the Palestinians for a future state. What do you guys think about this? Essentially, there have been attacks. It's an ongoing conflict for the control of the Gaza territory between Israel and Palestine. It seems like this has escalated recently to unprecedented level in the region.
We still haven't solved Middle East peace.
I don't think we'll ever solve it.
Not when you think your God is the reason that you own the land. No one can prove that.
Right. I'm sure there is one right religion, Stephen. There is one God, the right God. Everyone else is wrong.
Yeah, and it's called Pastafarianism. Get on board.
I support Judaism.
That is also acceptable, but you will still burn.
Oh, come on. Enough of burning. We've been burning for ages.
This conflict revolves around 2 displaced people that have had their family members, their friends, their colleagues get blown up, get attacked, and thus lead to generations of more disaffected youth. I don't see this changing, stopping anytime soon. To win over the hearts and minds and find a way to live together peacefully as best as you can.
What did it say about the Israeli attack? They said the Israelis did an attack. Apparently it was on a military base because it said most of the victims were military
militants. That's correct.
They seem to brush over that and not mention it very much in the article, which seems to suggest that there's a very anti-Israeli bias there, because I imagine that was a military significant target. If it wasn't, then they would have focused on that in the article article and said something like, oh, they targeted a civilian something, which inspired this. But since it was just brushed over lightly, it seems that's unlikely. And it was actually a military target, which means it was justified. And the retaliatory attacks of the Palestinians were definitely unjustified at that point, especially since it was targeting civilians. And so I think that from the article, which seems to have an anti-Israeli bias, the Israelis seem to be far more justified in both of the situations listed.
I would say that, but I feel like there have been a bunch of shootings just going on to and fro. So I don't really know how far you want to go back to actually see who started. Essentially, I think it's like a part of an ongoing conflict. And I feel there is a need to resolve it rather than picking up a starting point, because you have one land, everyone wants to claim it. It's one of the most militarized areas in the world. As far as the authenticity of article, I feel like the bias is obvious because the article is from Guardian and the US obviously opposes the settlement construction in East Jerusalem because they tend to favor Palestine. So that doesn't really surprise me personally.
I'm sorry, are you stating that the US supports Palestine over Israel?
The U.S. government supports Israel. The U.S. media supports Palestine, I think would be the...
Yes, the government supports Israel.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot more sense. Clarified. Thank you for doing that. I feel that's a good point that attacking a military base is, and I shudder to say this, more honorable than attacking citizens. It's still death and killing. I would prefer to avoid it, but starting there would make it more warlike than this attack on people, completely unrelated to any sort of war.
True. Anyways, moving on to you, Stephen.
Sure. My article today is maybe related. It is in regards to drone strikes that happened in Iran, a weapons factory in the central city of Isfahan, and it appears to fit a pattern of strikes that have been attributed to Israel in the past. Overnight, a series of powerful explosions damaged an Iranian government weapons factory in the city of Isfahan. Officials said that this was a coordinated drone strike. They did note that there was no immediate confirmation on who was responsible. These attacks do appear to fit a pattern of strikes against strategic sites across Iran, attributed to Israel in years before. That facility in particular was a production hub for drones and missiles that have been used across the Middle East and by Russian forces in Ukraine. Drones themselves have been playing an increasing role in this shadow war between Iran and Israel and in the surrounding area since 2019. And the stakes are primarily highest in Iran, whose nuclear program has been targeted repeatedly and attempts to be sabotaged. For instance, the country's top scientist was assassinated in 2020. A nuclear facility was struck in 2021. The Karaj facility was struck the same year. And then in 2022, another attack damaged a drone facility, destroying at least 120 crafts. However, we look at it, it is going after Iranian weapons. Iranian officials claimed on Sunday that 2 drones had been shot down and another had only inflicted minor damage, though the footage from the scene showed a rather powerful blast. So either that was a secondary explosion or a payload much higher than a drone could support. Israel is known to be training pilots for the F-35 for a possible attack on Iran, and it has used the warplanes to attack Iranian interests in Syria, including sites where drone parts were being delivered to the Lebanese militant Hezbollah. Attack does come at a sensitive time for Iran, as we have covered in previous videos. There are active protests there, primarily over the death of a Kurdish woman who was in custody. These protests have shown that the Iranian government is susceptible to that. It's destabilization on top of a pretty unstable situation. At the same time, the Biden administration has stalled nuclear deals with Iran, even as Iran gets closer and closer to being able to produce weapons-grade material. That threshold has been something in particular that Israel has vowed to prevent. Within all this conflict, Tehran has agreed to limit the nuclear work in return for eased sanctions. Israel itself has remained silent in the aftermath of this attack, though the Jerusalem Post noted that there are a few organizations besides Mossad that have reported to have advanced and surgical strike capabilities. Article also notes that Iranian troops have been firing missiles in the region in the past year, claiming to do it on behalf of a Mossad agency that could have been set up in a Kurdish area, which the Kurdish government has strongly denied. However, this conflict continues. Sort of interesting situation of he said, she said, and obviously very early information. But what do you think, AJ?
I don't have any opinion on it, unfortunately.
Sure.
Tom, Dan.
Well, Iran poses an existential threat to Israel.
Do we have any data on how many drone strikes Iran has used against Israel?
It's a good question. Probably not immediately prepared in that article, just about their strikes on areas in the Kurdish region. It does seem like this has been a very back and forth thing, and that Israel's interests primarily have been in halting any sort of nuclear development in Iran.
Well, it said it was a drone facility, right? And that there has been reported attacks of Israel has used drone strikes on other drone-related facilities by Iran. And so if it seems like Israel is specifically targeting drone-related factories, it must mean drones are either a potential future threat or a current threat to Israel. It hasn't been used. And so that seems like information that the article should have included. Like, what has Iran been doing to Israel to make drones a relevant threat? Just saying that Israel has done some strikes on drone-related things tells us nothing about what's actually going on. It seems like the people who wrote the article are just doing a bad job of actually presenting the data relevant to the actual case. Like, we need to know, why would Israel do this? What is the impetus of the attack? Why target that facility in particular? Are they wrong that it's a drone thing? What is the actual data here? They didn't say anything. It's gossip mostly.
Well, what we've seen is that Iran has been a state sponsor of terror waged in countries such as Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. So their ability to wage war, whether it be through drones or the use of other types of machinery, devices, can cause existential threats across the world, whether it be what we've seen in Ukraine with the Russians, or the potential to be used against Israel, who they have sworn to try to wipe off the face of the earth. I think you'll see a continuation of Israel to try to limit Iran's potential to cause strikes within Israel's home territory, whether it come from Iran directly or through other countries such as Lebanon or Syria.
Definitely, I would agree with all of that. I just think that the article should in particular bring up the relevant data of like, why this facility, why is Israel doing this? Like, it doesn't tell us any of that. The article itself doesn't give us any of the information that's actually relevant to the case. Like, why?
Yeah, it appears that the max that they really go into it is the commentary on the shadow war fought over the skies of Iraq and Syria, in the Persian Gulf, and even the Eastern Mediterranean. There's not really much beyond that. It's a pretty summarizing statement.
We've seen Iran kick out the international community's ability to surveil their development of nuclear materials. Now, Iran, on one hand, will speak of the peaceful use of nuclear materials for power, for energy, for keeping their country and their citizens fed, keeping them with electricity to keep the lights on, or to potentially centrifuge that material into more dangerous concentrations that could be used in nuclear weapons.
Last summer, Iranian troops fired several missiles at Kurdish business near Erbil. That was perhaps an inciting thing because they claimed it was against Mossad officials that were being used to direct drone strikes in Iran. Kurdish government denies this and said that the house was empty. However, that seems to be maybe kind of this back and forth between, well, you're firing at us with drone strikes, or you're threatening to do this, so we're attacking X or Y. This could be a repeat of that back and forth.
Sure.
Do we want to go to the next?
Yes, let's do it.
All right, Dan, talk to us about the FDA.
Absolutely. On Thursday, the United States FDA's Committee of Independent Vaccine Experts gathered to discuss future COVID-19 vaccination recommendations. The FDA wants COVID vaccination schedules to model current annual flu shot models. They have thought about reformulating the vaccines in the first half of the year and rolling them out in the fall ahead of the potential change in COVID-19 in the winter months. Upon having this meeting, a charged discussion ensued. There's a lot of uncertainty regarding COVID-19 vaccines. We're not entirely sure as to the seasonality of COVID-19. Will it model what we see with other respiratory viruses, such as RSV or the flu? Is there a possible futility of chasing these fast changing variants and subvariants? What about the youth? Do our young and healthy need to get frequent COVID vaccinations? Getting frequent COVID vaccine booster need to have their vaccines changed to offer new protection when it's already going to protect them against severe disease, but it may only offer short-lived protection against infection. Part of this discussion was based on a desire to simplify our current immunization schedule. How frequently should people get vaccines? And the idea might be to have adults get get 1 dose and maybe 2 doses for children or high-risk adults. Ultimately, vaccines don't just need to be available, they need to be used. So how are we going to get our public to get on board? Might you have the COVID-19 vaccines happen around the same time that one might get a flu shot? You go into the doctor or a place that you might get a vaccine and get both of them at the same time. There are questions about which strains to include in vaccine. We have this bivalent vaccine, which has been shown to offer superior protection compared with a monovalent COVID-19 vaccination. But the question is, do we need to have the original strain be available in the vaccine if that original strain, based off of the virus from Wuhan, is no longer circulating? From what we've seen, our current flu vaccination schedule serves us quite well. Modeling COVID-19 vaccinations after this might do us quite a bit of good. What do you think about it?
I thought COVID went away. That's what the news was. It's coming back, getting angrier. COVID and flu, how do they tie it together? Are we like modeling the way we have flu vaccination seasonal? Are we modeling the COVID vaccination on the similar scenario? Like, I'm slightly confused.
Yeah, that's what I heard. I feel like this has been the theory for a long time with how rapidly COVID evolves. We kind of wondered, would we have to have a regular vaccine in order to provide protection? And I think the big question is, how much protection does this vaccine provide? How long? How often do we need to be doing this? It does seem like we are able to deliver it at the same time as the influenza vaccine this past year. That's how I got mine, was both the COVID and the flu shot, same time. Doesn't really cause any issue. But I feel like with how politically charged COVID became, there's a great risk for the same thing happening at a yearly cadence. And that is something, unfortunately, I don't see going away, even if COVID doesn't.
I agree. What do you think, Tom?
I think as a shorthand, it's still convenient to use flu as a blueprint or framework in order to model how we treat other viruses, because it works. And so using it as a baseline is a safe and effective way to do it. I don't think the amount of people who would take it is going to increase. It's probably going to decrease over time. People are going to become less enthusiastic. And so it's going to lead more towards the people who have no interest in taking it are going to increase, and it's going to lead to less effectiveness. And we're going to have to primarily rely on natural immunity is going to be the most common effective basis. And how long does natural immunity last? And so it'd probably be better to base injection times based on how long the natural immunity lasts rather than simply relying on the flu. But until you actually know what that is, we can use the flu as a nice baseline to just work off of.
I think that's it. This is something already familiar. People at least know what the standard is. And I know there's plenty of people who debate the flu vaccine because often it feels like a shot in the dark. There's a lot of good work that goes into developing that, but often it's an educated guess over what strains we're going to see that year in which region. We'll probably have to do similar things with COVID. I think that could drive a similar attitude where people go, I still got sick last year, even though I got the vaccine. It's not worth anything. When the reality is maybe they only got mildly sick because they got the vaccine, and it could have been much, much worse.
True. Dan, since you're a doctor, what's the efficacy of flu vaccine? What's the probability of getting flu once you get vaccinated for that particular season? What is the likelihood of you still getting flu?
That's a great question, AJ. And I think that will change each year. We tend to look at places in the Southern Hemisphere, such as Australia, to see how bad is their flu season? How likely are we to have a bad flu season? And our flu vaccines, although they may not prevent you from getting the flu entirely, they do a good job at limiting how severe your infection might be. And we're looking at the same thing here. Tom asked a great question about natural immunity. Well, I don't know that natural immunity will ever provide a sufficient amount of protection. The question will be, what needs to be the rate of our vaccinations to keep up a sufficient herd immunity? But we've seen how many people have died from COVID-19, and that is despite the preventative measures that we've taken, from social distancing to masking and other things that we've done to try to limit the spread of COVID-19. If we look at the models that came out towards the beginning of the pandemic, it was thought that if 50% of Americans were exposed to it, and if 1% of those Americans Americans ended up getting COVID-19, though we might see 1.1 to 2.2 million American deaths within 1 year. Now, luckily, because of measures such as social distancing, masking, vaccines, and other measures, we've been able to have a death rate substantially lower. But what will we do when people stop caring? I don't know.
True. Here's the thing. The standard of vaccinations are different among different countries, right? Certain countries have more rampant vaccination drives. Some are lax about it. So the idea of having a cohesive natural immunity in a global environment, how do you see that unfurling?
I think it's a great question that I don't know the answer. And I think that time will tell.
Essentially, what I'm trying to figure out, for example, are we heading towards a path like smallpox or polio where we were able to fight it off? Or is this going to be a perennial thing where it's seasonal in nature? Or maybe it's its own thing? I don't know.
COVID-19 is here to stay. It's not something that we are going to fight off and get rid of, at least by our current measures.
So essentially, it's going to be a part of us.
Yeah, we will learn to live with it and potentially die with it.
Cool. I don't think I have any more questions related to that. Do have a lot of biases and opinions and a lot of political rhetorics to hear about that. That is always interesting, especially when Trump is contesting for 2024 elections.
I don't have anything else to say about COVID-19 right now.
No.
It's a shit show.
Yeah. And it's 23. We started talking about 19. So that says something.
Yeah. And just like in real life, if you're 23 and still talking about 19-year-olds, it's a shit show. Same thing with COVID.
Subjective.
Kind of.
I don't have anything to add. What about you, Tom?
Not really. I think that's just going to come down to how fast people stop caring, which is going to be pretty fast, I imagine.
And I'm just surprised they've not stopped caring yet.
It really depends on region.
Yeah.
When I visited family in Florida, they stopped caring about it several years ago. Everyone just kind of looks at COVID as if they caught the cold.
All right. The Republicans never cared. So the question is when are the Democrats going to stop caring? And I don't mean the political side. I mean the actual people. Because I think we see even now that the amount of Democrats who are still taking boosters and things has decreased significantly.
Is it because they've already taken boosters and they have more reliability that their immune system is more capable of fighting it off than it was before they took the vaccines and boosters? Or is it that they are just not caring about COVID anymore? Where are you heading with that?
There's a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons is because it's no longer mandated by a bunch of different organizations. A lot of people aren't going to take it. So if you don't have to take it for your job, then a lot of people aren't going to take it. Other reasons are if you've already taken one and you don't feel like it did anything or helped you, you won't take it. And if you already took one and you don't want to take the booster shot, you're not going to take it. And so everybody has their own particular reasons, but every additional reason is going to have fall off where people have one reason and that's going to stop some percent of people and some other people have a different reason that's going to stop another set of people. And eventually it's going to continue to increase over time.
Pandemic fatigue has been with us. And I think you're right. It's getting stronger. And the question is, how do you help people see what they prevented by getting vaccinated? They got vaccinated, they got a booster, but do they truly get to see that severe illness that they avoided or their potential death or the death of a loved one who might have contracted it from them?
I think the increase in prices is also going to have an effect. PIFSR is going private and increasing their prices, which is supposedly going to be covered by insurance or whatever, but that's unlikely. Insurance covers nothing. They will cheat every chance they have to not cover it. And so that's going to cost people more money, and in which case a lot of people are going to drop off because they just don't want to pay.
Sure. So how to make it effective is to hit people in their pocketbook. If your job mandates that you have it, if a place where you want to go buy your goods or get your services mandates it, you're more likely to get vaccinated, to take precautions. But if not, why continue? I think people will ask that question of themselves.
To incentivize it, it would need to be affordable, accessible, convenient, and well justified.
Are we talking about U.S. healthcare?
It's a pretty good analog for U.S. healthcare.
I mean, you said the four things, which probably one healthcare in the world I want associated with, and not in the same sentence. You know, affordable, accessible, available, and all that.
In theory, that's what everyone wants out of a healthcare system and what everyone should want out of a vaccine. Whether or not we will see that, time tells everything.
Yeah. I feel it's unlikely, at least in the short run, maybe future generations. I don't know.
Cool. Do you want to take us home, AJ?
Yeah, definitely. All right, guys. Thanks, Tom, for joining us. It was a ride of an episode where we were all over the place. We covered some good articles, some articles from COVID-related news, some from Iran, some from Russian South African issues related to docking of a vessel, as well as some more news from the globe. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Feel free to follow, subscribe, like. There's a link in the description. And please follow Tom. He has wonderful insights about a lot of things. And hopefully you learn as we have. And yeah, we continue to be chaotic, bringing you some more random news all over the globe. And yep, signing off, Dr. Dan, Steven, AJ, and Tom.
Bye, y'all.
Take care.
See you.